recorded. There you go. Got it. We're happy to have that. So I will be admitting people into the forum tonight as they pop into the waiting room. Good evening and welcome to all of you that are joining us tonight. Again, remember to mute your audio if you're not speaking. And as the host, we can mute you as well if we need to. So if you forget about that, we have the functionality to do that as well. Welcome to our first session of our educational forum. It is called Shaping Education, Decisions and Impact. I want to remind you to save the date for the second session of this forum, which will be held via Zoom on Wednesday, October 20th. And that's going to be from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And we will have a new Zoom link that will be created for that second session. And you'll be able to register in advance and get reminders about that session. So you can check out our website and our social media accounts, and we'll have details with that Zoom link and registration information as well. You can follow Unity and Community on Instagram. We are at UIC and MEC. You can also connect with us via our website, and I will drop a link in the chat box with our website as well, so you can connect with us. And most importantly, if you would like to support the important work that Unity and Community does in the North Met community, you can always donate to our nonprofit on our website. That's my NPR moment. So if you would like to support us, we would appreciate that. My name is Dawn Kikitsis, and I will be tonight's moderator. I serve on the board of Unity and Community, and my daytime activities include being the Director of Marketing and Outreach for a nonprofit called Global Minds United. I want to welcome those who are familiar with Unity and Community. As you see by my name, we call it UIC for short. And I want to give a special welcome to those who are encountering us for the first time tonight. I'm excited that you found your way to our Zoom session this evening. Unity and Community, for those who are new, we are a diverse community. We are a diverse community-based nonprofit. And we are an organization that strives to achieve racial equity in the towns of North Mecklenburg. And we do that through small and large group engagement, as well as education and activism. So that's a little bit about Unity and Community. We do believe that education is a fundamental component for striving to achieve racial equity. And that's connected to many equity issues around affordable housing, around healthcare, employment, and beyond. And we're here tonight with our panelists to shed some light on the educational processes that impact our local community. We want to provide accurate information on how decisions get made and who makes those decisions around education. I would like to go ahead and introduce our panelists for this evening, so you know who will be leading the charge. So as you come in and you're admitted to the meeting, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, we would appreciate that, just as a reminder. And first off, I'm going to start with introducing Senator Natasha Marcus, who we are excited to have with us. Senator Marcus has a BA in public policy from Hamilton College and a law degree from Duke University School of Law. After passing the bar exam in 1994, Senator Marcus practiced law and clerked for a federal judge in Greensboro, and she moved to Davidson in 2007. She has been on the front lines of community work in North Carolina for decades, and that includes Moral Monday protests at the NCGA, grassroots efforts in gun violence, Habitat to curb gun violence, Habitat for Humanity builds, marches that support women's rights, as well as Black Lives Matter. She's volunteered at local free healthcare clinics. She's organized voter registration drives, and prior to taking office, she worked at the Ada Jenkins Center, which Diane Means, who's on the call today, is one of our Ada Jenkins Center representatives, who's also on the board of Unity and Community. Senator Marcus is the co-founder of the Democrats of North Mecklenburg, and a member of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense and the Catawba Riverkeepers Foundation. As a first-term senator, Natasha was elected by her peers to be the freshman leader, and in her second term, she was elected chair of the Mecklenburg County delegation to the NCGA and appointed to the Judiciary, Redistricting and Elections, Base Budget Appropriations and Agriculture, Natural and Economic Resources Appropriations Senate committees. Senator Marcus is a strong advocate for public schools, affordable health care, clean water, common sense gun safety reform, fair elections, better wages for working people, and local initiatives to serve the people of District 41. So we are excited and grateful to have Senator Marcus with us. I would also like to now introduce our second panelist, Jennifer Delahara. She serves as an elected at-large member of CMS's Board of Education. She is a native of Valdez, North Carolina. Valdez or Valdez? You'll have to correct us on that.
Valdez.
There you
That's
go.
all good.
She graduated from UNC Chapel Hill with a BA in Communication Studies, and then after a 5-year stint in California, she returned to North Carolina to pursue a master's in education at UNCC. Jennifer was an instructor in the English as a Second Language program for many years at CPCC and was the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Transit Authority in Louisville, Kentucky. Most recently, she held the position of Director of Education at International House, a nonprofit in Charlotte. So we want to welcome Jennifer as our second panelist for tonight's discussion. And then I would like to continue to introduce everyone. That includes Beth Thompson. Beth has served as the Assistant Superintendent for Academics in Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools since 2019. Previously, Beth was the principal at Whitewater Middle School from 2014 until 2019, and then principal at Whitewater Academy from 2010 until 2014. Both schools are in the CMS school system, and Beth was named CMS Principal of the Year in 2016. She earned her bachelor's degree in classics from Davidson College. I know we have some Davidson College alum here. And she earned her master's degree in educational leadership from Winthrop University as part of the first cohort of the CMS Principal Pipeline Initiative. So thank you, Beth, for joining us. And our last panelist tonight, who we're excited to have with us, is Dr. Brandy Nelson. Dr. Nelson holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in mathematics from Salem College, a master's in school administration from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and a doctorate of education from North Carolina State University. Dr. Nelson has devoted over 24 years of service to education, starting her career as a middle school math teacher in South Bronx. She taught high school math for several years before serving as an assistant principal in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's also held leadership roles for Teach for America and New Leaders in Charlotte, managing program implementation and educator support for teachers and school leaders. She joined CMS Schools as a high school principal and served 9 years in that role. And Dr. Nelson currently serves in the role of Executive Director for Learning and Teaching in CMS Schools. So I would like to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to participate in tonight's discussion. Before I turn the discussion over and get Jennifer up and running, I'd like to remind everyone that we will monitor the chat box, so feel free to ask questions or make comments. We will drop links in there for additional resources. We are excited tonight to engage in a respectful discussion with a kind tone and thoughtful words, along with patience with our Zoom platform. So I appreciate you all being here. And Jennifer, I'll let you get things kicked off.
I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it? Give me a couple thumbs up. Okay, wonderful. There we go. Well, good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be with you all here tonight on this distinguished panel. I also want to take a moment because I see one of my colleagues, District 4 Board of Education Representative Carol Sawyer is here with us tonight. So I do want to recognize Ms. Sawyer. You'll also notice that I'm wearing a red this evening, and I just want to, since this is an education event, call attention to that I'm wearing red for ed. And if you see educators wearing that, that is a sign for all of us to come together and support both educators in their profession and education. And that's what we're all here doing tonight. So I wanted to represent and wear red for ed. So thrilled that we're all here. Taking a moment to take a deeper look, to take a deeper dive into how decisions are made and then what the impact of those decisions are. We're going to sort of thread throughout the evening. We're going to look at how the recent social studies standards decisions came to be and how that trickles down as those decisions are made and how they're ultimately delivered to our children here in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. So that will be sort of the background theme as we go through this evening. Here we all are. We've already done introductions, so I won't repeat that, but I'm glad that is there. Maybe I should have shown that earlier. Sorry if I messed that up. I'm going to start with the statement tonight for something for us to consider, which is education in America is a highly regulated public service. And what that means is that all levels of government, federal, state, and local, there are governing bodies that oversee it. And I mention that because what that also means is that education is very political. And, if I had an email or $1 for every email I received, I'm going to tell you the story quickly, of people who start off emails by saying, what you need to do is take the politics out of it. And then they'll tell me whatever it is their particular concern is. And I always sort of smile when folks say that, because I know what they mean when they're saying that. But the point is this, is that because education is regulated at the federal, state, and local governments by politicians, people whom we all elect, it by default is political. So I do want to sort of set a tone also of us just thinking about how education is shaped, because it's shaped by elected officials. And so oftentimes if we seek change in education, we do need to really think about it in a political landscape and engage politically as we might seek change. Go to the next slide. So education is primarily a state and local responsibility. So in the context of the social studies standards, which I mentioned we would be weaving through here, I do want to point out that there's not a direct influence from the federal government as it relates to what we teach in the social studies classroom. So I did want to mention that. However, the federal government does play a role, and they set overarching policy. I'm sure you all remember the No Child Left Behind back from the Bush years, and then ESSA that you see here, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed by President Obama in 2015, and we are still under that sort of overarching policy is the law of the land. You can find out more about that, the federal government's role, in a link that I've asked Dawn to share in the chat if you want to take a deeper dive. I will point out, interestingly, how this played out this year, the federal government, something that I didn't realize until I was in it. Because our ESSA plans, and I'm certainly glad that Dr. Nelson and Beth are here with us tonight. Ms. Thompson, if I misspeak on this, please correct me later. But I learned through this year in the pandemic that our plans that we report up through the state and go ultimately, to the federal government is tied to testing. And the federal government ended up playing a very specific role with us this past year in the pandemic, both under the DeVos administration and the Cardona administration, as the decision was made both at the end of the year last year and in the spring to go ahead and have standardized tests. And we had to do that because it was tied into our ESSA plans. And so I'm just pointing that out, as sometimes we don't think so much about the federal government having a role, but certainly in the pandemic, we were able to see that in a very real way of their authority, and sort of we had to comply and have the standardized test. Another thing, way that the federal government plays a key role is in
pick up for Chris, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Someone may need to mute. Okay. Is with funding. So the federal government provides in a typical year about 10% of Charlotte Mecklenburg schools' financial resources. And that includes some special funding for exceptional children, for English language learners, for our housing insecure students. So there are special categories, if you will, of grants that we apply for, and they do provide specific funding. I say in a typical year because in this current budget cycle, because of some of the COVID-related funding that has come out of the federal government, this particular year, that percentage has increased. Okay. The state actually plays the largest regulatory role in public education. And that is in part because it's actually, education is not mentioned in our federal constitution specifically. So it's generally considered the rights of states to monitor public education, including through here in North Carolina, the General Assembly, which Senator Marcus is going to speak more specifically to that in a bit, and also the State Board of Education and the Department of Public Instruction. And even the governor has a role in this, and I'm going to explain that in just a few minutes. I've asked Dawn to drop a link here as well, because if you would, we're going to do sort of an overview of all of these different decision makers, but if you want to take a deeper dive, this article is How and Where Education Leaders Get Their Power is really good. It really breaks it down in deep detail if you'd like to go into that. All right. I'm trying to move. There we go, that's better. So who are these players? So first, let's talk about the State Board of Education for a moment. It consists of 13 members, including the Lieutenant Governor, the Treasurer, and 11 members that are appointed by the governor for 8-year overlapping terms, subject to confirmation by the General Assembly. 8 of the appointed members represent the 8 different education districts in the state, and then there are 3 at-large members. This is a picture of Mr. Eric Davis, who has held the chairmanship for the past 3 years. He is an at-large board member and the chair. Obviously, he was first appointed by Governor McCrory. And I actually spoke with him yesterday, and he sends his greetings to you all. He was very excited that we are doing this because he does feel like getting the right information in folks' hands is the way to go. So he was very happy that everyone was participating in this. I also spoke with our District 3 board representative, James Ford, who was appointed by Governor Cooper, and had a brief conversation with him earlier this week. And he talked about how the State Board of Education in North Carolina, to his knowledge, North Carolina has the only constitution where it's actually written in the Constitution the powers that the state board has. I thought that was an interesting piece of trivia. He talked about it being the second most powerful education policy making body behind the General Assembly, and they are there to enact legislation and set policy and guidance for districts. And every 7 to 10 years, they revise the standard course of study, which is what we're talking about tonight with the social studies standards. They do that for all subjects. The Department of Public Instruction is charged with working on that, presenting it up through the next lady we're going to speak about, our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, but it's the board that approves them and ultimately sends them our way, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I will tell you that the social study standards did get a bit controversial over the past year. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go back and listen to some of the conversation that took place around them coming to the decision of what the end product that we have today. And maybe not all subjects are controversial, but guess what? The next set of standards they're going to be reviewing are science. So indeed, it could be controversial again. I'm making a funny joke. I hope you all get that. So then we have our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Catherine Truitt, was elected in 2020. And she is a 4-year term. She does not make policy. She is charged with implementing the strategic plan, and she oversees the Department of Public Instruction. I think I mentioned that. Also, we have Mr. Dale Falwell, who's our state treasurer. He is an automatic voting member of the State Board of Education, and Mr. Mark Robinson, our Lieutenant Governor, who's also a voting member of the State Board of Education. All of them were elected or re-elected in 2020, serving 4-year terms. So while the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Truitt, is not a voting member. So the other 3, or the other 2, the state treasurer and the lieutenant governor, are voting members of the board. The state superintendent of public instruction is not, but certainly I think it's fair to say that she or whoever's in that position can influence policy. And we saw that play out this year. So here we have just a little snippet from what was known as the preamble to the state, the social studies standards. Some would say that that was presented as sort of a compromise, because again, there was some controversy about the language that was going to be used or not used. And then she presented this preamble, and Dawn is going to drop a link to the entire preamble that you can read on your own time to take a look at that and form your own opinion about that. So certainly there's a level of influence coming from the state superintendent of public instruction. And then the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, also, as I mentioned before, an automatic voting member on the board. Yeah, I just thought it was important that we point out, again, around some of the controversy, that he created what's known as the FACTS Task Force, the Fairness and Accountability in the Classroom for Teachers and Students. And I'm not going to say too much on that. I will, Dawn is going to put another link in the chat, because there's been some interesting articles written about the authority he may or may not have to actually form this task force. But again, I'll let you form your own opinion around that. But that will also possibly be spoken about more in part 2 of this session, as we on October 20th meet with teachers, educators, students, and talk about the impact and sort of fears and hopes that our educators have around moving forward with these new sets of standards. And actually, let me back up one. I'm going to back up just for a moment, because I just want to make this point one more time before we move on and we hear from our senator. That elections matter. I mentioned earlier that education is shaped by politicians. And of course, Mr. Davis here was appointed by a governor, and then these other 3 are elected officials. And so I just wanted to sort of round this point out by, no matter where you stand on your beliefs of where you are, I just want us to understand that if we want to effectuate change in education, then we need to engage politically and think about who we vote for at all levels. It's not just the governor or just the local school board rep, but it's all of these folks who have a role to play in forming education policy. And now, to take a deeper dive into the General Assembly's role, I'm going to pass it over to our Senator Natasha Marcus.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's an honor to be here with you and the other education experts on the panel tonight. I am not an education expert, although I love public education and I love teachers. My mother, if you know me at all, you know that my mother was a very dedicated teacher for 35 years, and I'm so proud of her and how many students she influenced over the years, and really ingrained in me that it is a profession that deserves a lot of respect. And so it's one of the reasons I ran for office. And I'm always interested in doing what I can to improve public education here in North Carolina. So thank you for all that you do, Jennifer, on the board, and Carol Sawyer too, for joining us tonight. So, and then we have Principal of the Year on the panel today. I hardly feel like I should even talk, but I will, because I do think I have some specifics that I can share with the folks who've joined us tonight that might be interesting. So from the state level, as a state legislator, we handle a lot of subjects. Education is just one of many things that we touch on. But we don't have as much influence over the specifics about the things that usually parents are upset about or hear about in the news are usually not decided at the level of the state legislature. So I often am telling people when they email or call, you actually need to speak with the CMS school board. They're making that decision, or, you know, I try to direct people to who is in charge. But I will say, as this slide indicates, that the General Assembly does sometimes set education standards. We weigh in. Sometimes it seems that the theme is the General Assembly will weigh in on matters that are controversial, issues that might motivate voters to vote for a certain party seem to be the issues on which the General Assembly wants to get involved. So here are just some examples that I thought showed a good span of the kinds of things that the General Assembly has passed statewide statutes on. So reproductive health standards, also known as sex ed. You didn't think this was going to be a sexy conversation tonight, did you? But it is. So there are very specific statutes about what must be taught in our public schools as related to sex ed and health standard, reproductive health standards, as they call it. And it includes, there are several, I couldn't include them all here, but just as point of interest, I think it's interesting that in North Carolina, it is required that we, quote, teach that a mutually faithful, monogamous, heterosexual relationship in the context of marriage is the best lifelong means of avoiding sexually transmitted disease, including HIV/AIDS. That's directly out of the statute. That's what teachers must teach our children. They also must teach, and I agree with this one, quote, teach about the effectiveness and safety of all FDA-approved contraceptive methods in preventing pregnancy, which I got to give our state some credit for including this, because some states forbid mentioning contraceptive methods at all in public education. They're only to tell children, you know, which year the abstinence only and no more information. So at least we're not there. We're a little more progressive than some states in allowing that. And then we recently amended this statute to include that there be some provisions to prevent and provide more awareness about sex trafficking and sexual abuse, I believe is in there too. That's not on the slide, but I believe that's relevant too. So we are addressing new things that we should be, and I think that's good. So that's one example that the General Assembly has weighed in on that. So if you're mad about any of that, get in touch with your state legislator, because that is within the realm of what we do. The second one that I thought was interesting relates to Economics and Financial Literacy Act. So we passed this since I've been there, and it mandates that all students take a full semester of economic and personal finance in order to graduate. The minimum standards are set in the statute, but then we give discretion to the Board of Education, as Jennifer just talked about, to flesh out all the details. So this isn't quite as specific as the first one I mentioned, but there are quite a few specifics in there. And one thing it doesn't mention, but is important to note, is that we passed this and everyone's in favor of high school students knowing financial literacy, like, you know, to know not to run up a credit card. And what does that mean when you use a debit card? And what does that do to your credit rating and all those things? It's great that high school students are going to learn those things. But one of the issues in this, when we passed this, was many teachers told legislators, most of whom are not teachers and don't have any real understanding of how this works, that if you pass this, we're not going to have time to teach other subjects, such as American history. And they said, well, that's not in there. It doesn't require that you don't teach American history. But those of us who were in the know knew that it was going to force, you got to find, you know, time in the day. There's only so much time in the day to teach. And so what ended up happening is now American History 1 and 2 used to be two separate courses and much more thorough. Now it's pushed into one course in order to fit this economic and personal finance in. So for good or bad, the General Assembly made that change. The third one has been in the news a lot lately. I hate to give it a whole lot of oxygen, but there was that anti-critical race theory bill. It did pass the General Assembly, but it's been vetoed by Governor Cooper, and it was an attempt to dictate standards about what teachers could say, how they had to phrase things, whether they could say that things that happened in history were bad or good. They were supposed to teach it without any embellishment about an opinion. And it was very controversial for that. Oh, can we go back? Because there's one more thing I just wanted to mention. Somehow jumped ahead here. Oh, other way.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
And then the last one, I left it in here because I thought it was a nice example of, I generally think the General Assembly, it is my general attitude that we should not be weighing in on education standards because we're not educators. And we generally don't ask educators when we pass these things. But here's one that I think I would support as long as it didn't impact the schedule in other ways. But there's a bill, it's been introduced a few times by my party, to integrate education on the Holocaust and genocide. It would follow the federal Never Again Education Act and would require the state board to integrate those subjects, what happened in the Holocaust and genocide generally in other places over history, into the standard course of study. It's a bill that's just stuck in a House committee. People in charge aren't picking it up and running with it. But that's another example of where the General Assembly might want to weigh in on education standards. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So other than the things I just mentioned where the General Assembly decides to get in, it is my opinion, and I think most would agree with me, that the state's main role when it comes to public education is to fund it. Because unlike some states, North Carolina says that education funding comes from the state. And the General Assembly has a huge budget and a big chunk of it goes to public education. Local governments, as is noted here in bullet point 2, small parens 2, local governments can have some responsibility for supplements. You hear about that, how the county has to give the CMS some additional money, but the majority of the funding is supposed to come from the state. And that's because we have a unique constitution in North Carolina. And it says right there in bold at the top that the people have a right to the privilege of education, and it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right. And later in the Constitution, it says, I won't read that whole thing, but we shall provide by taxation and other means a system of free public schools, and they should have wherein equal opportunity shall be provided for all students. And so I have to mention, I don't want to get too off course in what tonight is about, but I have to mention the Leandro ruling. If you haven't heard about it yet, it is, I think, critical to our fight for public education. It's a landmark court ruling way back in 1997, and it's still not resolved because we're still fighting, but it reaffirmed that North Carolina's constitutional duty is to ensure that all children have the opportunity to receive, here's the magic language, quote, a sound basic education. And the courts have ruled multiple times that the state is failing to meet its constitutional obligations and must increase funding. And yet it's not happening because the General Assembly and the courts are in basically a legal standoff. Well, one side says you can't make us do it, and the other side says, oh yes, we can, you better do it. And no one really knows what's going to happen in the end, because if the General Assembly just keeps refusing, which is what they've been doing, how do the courts make them allocate additional funds to meet that constitutional obligation? It's going to be a really interesting question. That's the kind of stuff that's interesting to me anyway, but I love public policy. So, and then of course, in the meantime, teacher pay per pupil spending remains super low in North Carolina. And that's really frustrating for someone like me who thinks teachers are professionals and deserve to be paid a wage that makes them want to stay and teach in North Carolina. And per pupil spending obviously matters, because if we're cutting that short and relying just on local supplements, then wealthier counties those kids get a little more and those teachers get paid a little better, but that's not good for the state as a whole. That's the end of my slides. I do want to mention just briefly, Jennifer mentioned federal law. There's one that I think is important to mention. It's Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it's about students who have disabilities. And it does require, I'll read it directly, protects the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal funds. So our schools obviously receive federal funds, and this regulation requires the school district to provide, and here's the magic language there, quote, a free appropriate public education to each qualified person with a disability in that school's jurisdiction. So that's why there are the fights. We had it just this week with whether K through 2 students should be able to have a virtual option if it's not safe for them to be in school right now. That law is part of that, why our schools have to do something to provide an education for those with a disability. And then I'll also say it's not K through 12, but it's really interesting to know that the North Carolina Constitution also requires, when it comes to public institutions of higher education, so our UNC system, that the state is required to provide, quote, as far as practicable, that this higher education be extended to the people of the state, quote, free of expense. So it's supposed to be free to go to college in North Carolina. And every year tuition creeps up, fees creep up, again, because the state is not funding public education the way I believe it should. So again, that's a little off topic, but I couldn't stop myself from mentioning that. So I will hand it over now. I don't know who's next, but I think it's Dr. Brandy Nelson. Are you next, or is it Beth Thompson? Or maybe you're both speaking together, but either way, thank you for your attention, everybody. I'll stay on in case there are any questions, and I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank y'all so much. I feel like I just learned a lot. So thank you for that. Namely, I've got a 17-year-old, so I think college being free sounds really good right now. So thank you for that. Brandy and I are going to tag team if that's okay. But what we're going to do is talk just a little bit about what it looks like when an LEA, so a local education agency of which Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools is one, receive those standards and how those standards get into classrooms to be taught by teachers. So on the next slide, it talks just a little bit about the idea that it is individual districts who manage the curriculum and the professional development. And the local Board of Education, of who met last night, sets that policy. The superintendent oversees operations. And there are some discretionary decisions that happen at the school level as well. Once we receive standards from the state, so in the case of our current social studies standards, those were finally voted on and approved in February of this past year. Then in addition to those standards, we await eagerly in the academics departments what are called unpacking documents that tell us more deeply what students should know and be able to do as a result of that standard. So I'll give you an example. Our first grade students with our current standards one of the standards says that students need to understand how people engage and participate in community. That's what the standard says, how people engage and participate in community. But once we receive what's called that unpacking document, it tells us much more deeply what student mastery of that standard would look like. What should students be able to do? What should they understand? What they'll know, what some example topics might look like, and then how a teacher might assess that a student truly is able to master that standard. So obviously, a standard is going to be a more general area of learning, and then an unpacking document is going to tell us more specifically what it is a student might do. So in the case of that particular standard, it would say something like a student needs to be able to provide 3 examples of how a person could participate in community and shape the community around them. It doesn't say what that shaping looks like, but it is asking students to be able to draw a connection between participating in their community and being able, and what happens to their community or could happen within their community as a result of those actions. We also usually receive documents that are called crosswalk documents, and those support local districts in being able to compare and contrast the new standards to the old standards. So they'll be it's almost like a cheat sheet, so to speak, of what had been in place and then what's currently in place. And that helps tremendously as districts are then able to look at what it looks like to then put those standards in motion. specific to this year, and then Brandy's going to talk a little bit about what's next. The standards for social studies were voted on in February, and we received elementary unpacking documents in June and middle school unpacking documents in July. Note that teachers come back to school to work in August. So let me just do that timeline for you one more time. The new standards were voted on in February and approved. Unpacking documents for elementary came in late June, and unpacking documents for middle school came in July. So this particular runway was pretty short. So within that short amount of time, AKA about 4 weeks time for middle grades, districts then do, Dr. Nelson, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, so the next phase of the process is we have to make some choices around curriculum. So we can either go through a process of procurement, which is it's policy mandated around how do we go about securing an actual curriculum. And when we say curriculum, our definition is not only the assessments, but also the lesson plans, the student manuals, teacher resources, et cetera. It's a full complement. So we either do that or we engage in a curricular resource development where we're creating curricular resources. So we'll do that. We go through the process of doing that. And then we also provide additional resources, i.e. text, assessments, implementation guidance, et cetera, because even as great as a curriculum might be, there's still contextual information in Charlotte in terms of how we operationalize these unpacking documents and these standards. So we'll do that work, and that is done cross-departmental with our EC department, our MTSS department, our accountability department, our EL department, et cetera, our advanced studies and advanced coursework department. And then lastly, we also provision professional development for implementing the standards, because not only are we provisioning the written curriculum, i.e. what's written down on the page, we also are supporting our teachers and our teacher leaders and our school leaders in making sure that it's being implemented at the right rate and also at the level of quality necessary in order for students to master that standard around building community.
Okay, so now I think it's coming back to me, and I'm going to speak just a little bit more about the local Board of Education. Now that we've heard what the district does, I'm so thrilled that our two CMS staff members are here tonight to explain this process, because I learned a little bit more as well. As already mentioned, we set policy. We do several things within our governance framework, but I do want to take a moment to talk about the curriculum. Certainly we have oversight on the Board of Education over the curriculum. Staff communicates to us via the superintendent's office about decisions that are being made, and we have an opportunity to ask questions. We don't typically take votes on curriculum in this situation. So for example, I knew that the packing documents came, that they came late, and our staff was busy scurrying around to make this happen, but it wasn't something that we take a vote on. So I do think that that's important in sort of separating the difference between the operational work, which falls under the superintendent, and then the governance work. And if I could just take another plug to just, lift up our CMS staff, just to say that the central office staff is really important. If you listen to what they do and how they have to make those decisions over purchasing new curriculum or designing new curriculum, getting those resources in the hands of teachers, we certainly love our student-facing teachers and educators who are working directly with the students, but make no mistake that having a strong central office staff to support those educators and get them the resources that they need is also really, really important. And so I'm going to ask Dawn to drop my last document in the chat because it sort of breaks down what I was describing earlier about the difference between the operational work and the governance work. So one of the primary role of the Board of Education, the local Board of Education, is to employ the superintendent. And we delegate authorities to him or her, if it's a she, we delegate those authorities to execute the work, and then we have oversight. And you know, it's something that we're constantly working on, sort of educating the community on, and honestly, even re-educating ourselves. If you watched our board meeting last night, we actually had a 3-hour board workshop with a consultant that we've been working with who is helping us to better define what is operational work and what is true governance work so that we can be the best governing body that we need to be. And sometimes that may mean not being as involved in the operational work. I just, you know, wanted to point that out as it relates to the social studies standards. And you can take a look at that document if you would like to take a closer look at how we're trying to educate ourselves and the community on how to divide up that work. But I do think that certainly as it relates to things about social studies, we do set a tone in the district as well. Certainly, we've been very proud as an organization to state that boldly that we are striving to be an anti-racist organization. And so certainly that tone that the board and through the superintendent sets throughout the organization is important. And also as it relates to our budget. So one of the other primary responsibilities that the Board of Education has is approving our budget. So our staff members tonight talked about the professional development, for example. I know that's something that's really important to me, to make sure that when I'm looking at our budget, that we are investing the appropriate amount of funds to help our teachers develop so that they can deliver all curriculum with the intent that it was intended, or the intent that, you know, it was designed for. And so those are the sort of decisions that we make in a governance role, in addition to also student assignment and those sort of things that we actually take votes on that can actually impact if we're able to proportion the funds the right way that helps our teachers be the best that they can actually be. I'll give you a quick example on some of the things that we do with the board. Last night we had 4 action items. One was actually a local policy that we decided upon. It was a social media policy for our staff. And that's something that we generated and decided on locally and voted on locally. The other 3 action items that we voted on last night were actually in response to legislation that was passed. And so I would encourage everyone to pay attention to that as well, because oftentimes we are responding to what the General Assembly does, or maybe a direction that the State Board of Education has defined based on legislation or based on funding, given us direction on what we need to do. So last night, for example, and actually Senator Marcus, I mentioned your name from the dais because we did pass the 5 days, giving the superintendent the 5 days that was your Save the Spring Break Act legislation that was passed this year. And so because that legislation was pushed through in part because of Senator Marcus and others who brought that forth, then we now had an opportunity, because in North Carolina, without the expressed written authority coming from either the Constitution or statutes that are passed, we don't have the authority outside of that. And so now that that legislation was passed, we now had an option. We didn't have to choose it, but now we had the option. And of course, CMS wanted that option. So if we have weather days, or, you know, the power goes out on a particular building because a tree falls on the, you know, somewhere and knocks out the power, the superintendent now has the authority to declare that school, maybe just for that one day, or half of the county that suffers from bad weather, that they could go to remote learning. Now that we have all of the technology and all of the resources online, it's a great way to take advantage and not have to have the makeup days because we have the remote technology. So I'm just pointing that out because of the 4 actions last night, 3 of them were in response to legislation that either gave us authority or areas we had to comply And then one was something that we did locally in looking at a social media policy. What else do I want to say? Oh, I guess I'll just wrap it up by saying, I'm glad that Ms. Thompson and Dr. Nelson were here to explain in more detail how the social studies standards were passed. I do look forward to our next session where we bring in more educators to talk about that. But before we do that, there is one other level of influence here that our schools have, where it's school-based, the principals, I should say, have some discretion over. And I'm actually going to pass it to our moderator, Dawn, this evening, who has witnessed this firsthand at Huff High School, and she'll explain a little bit about some of the discretionary decisions that our local principals can make.
Thank you. So, for example, to get even more specific on a school level, my children attend Huff High School, and so being both a parent at Huff High School as well as being affiliated with the nonprofit that I work for, Global Minds United, we were able to connect with the longtime former principal, Dr. Rosenbach, and she brought it. It was a mutual partnership in the sense that at a time when so much was going on in our culture, Dr. Rosenbach felt like she was getting pushback from her students with questions, with things, with the way things were being dealt with or not dealt with within the school. And she felt that she wanted to be better equipped to answer those questions with her students and with her staff. And so Global Minds United worked with Dr. Rosenbach on what she wanted to accomplish. And she felt that the platform on global education and diversity and inclusion was the best direction for her as a leader, as well as her staff. So we partner with Huff High School, and we do consulting with stakeholders within the school. So we work with administrators, we work with staff, we do have student stakeholders are part of that consulting, so that we can equip them with messaging, with offerings, with best practices, and they then can roll those out related to global education, diversity, and inclusion. So that they don't have to keep coming back to Global Minds United. We are equipping all of those stakeholders to continue that and create that change over a period of time within their schools. So what we're actually doing over the next, we started with them last year and we will continue this year. And so we did training with them on implicit bias, global education, diversity and inclusion. We did training on building our identities. We did a mini training session on microaggressions that the staff then used to do some role playing with the other staff members at the school. We are going to be doing human rights and the UN Sustainable Development Goals training. We will then do dialoguing differences, as well as peace building and conflict resolution. And then we wrap up with change management. So after a school has gone through 2 years of these 6 trainings, as well as being, as well as the consulting, then we help them with, okay, now your school is changing. How do you manage that change and that culture within your school after all of this training? So we've worked with Miss Lloyd in the Diversity and Inclusion Office at CMS, and she has given us a thumbs up on encouraging us to connect with other schools. So we're looking forward to that and connecting with additional schools. But again, that partnership came out of Dr. Rosenbach's leadership as a principal within that school. And she was able then to allow us to create that partnership. So you can see how the funnel goes down all the way to the leadership of a principal. Is there anything else, Jennifer, you wanted to add?
No, not at all. I just had to put myself on mute for a moment because my daughter came home and my dog started barking. So forgive me. the way it is when we're Zooming. I just want to remind everyone what Dawn mentioned at the beginning. We are having the session 2 that is coming up on Wednesday, October 20th. Here, I believe Dr. Nelson will be back with us again. I hope so. We got all that worked out, as well as some social studies teachers and students, including our very own Brianna Fowler, who is our student advisor to the Board of Education. So she will be with us and another student as well. And so we'll have an even richer discussion, talking about the impact that is felt by all of these decision makers. And I also want, before we go to Q&A and passing it back to Dawn, I do want to recognize, I think I saw at-large board member, Miss Lenora Shipp, who has joined us as well. And I definitely wanted to acknowledge her presence, and I hope I didn't miss anyone else. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen as we do the Q&A so that Dawn can see everyone's lovely face.
Thank you so much. I certainly appreciate that. Miss Houston, would you like to add?
I just wanted to give kudos to Huff High School under the leadership of Laura Rosenbach, for someone that was looking from the outside to see the work and the labor that was done to bridge some of the racial gaps and divide at Huff High School as a result of your work and as a result of the school's work. One of the things that I was proud of is during the time of the George Floyd, how the students took the action along with Unity in the Community and others to lead peaceful marches, solidarity marches, and did some wonderful things. I was in the background for the one in Davison, and I learned later that those Huff students were leaders of the pack, but there are some other great things. And Huff, I was in the beginning of that school starting. They had a rough start racially in many ways, but I've watched for the last 11 years the major improvements. There's still work to be done, but kudos to you, Dawn, and the work of the school.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate that. One of the things we were excited about too is we offered a summer summit. It was a one-day event, and we had students, 50 high school students from 15 different local schools around CMS, and all of those students got to collaborate with each other and really become change agents in their communities to create student groups, to engage in, parent groups. So there's definitely a hunger for the youth in our area to really be engaged. And I just want to remind everyone that the reason that Unity and Community set up this platform is one of the key pieces that many of us hear in our small groups with Unity and Community, and the demographic of some of the people in our organization are such that they recognize what they felt they weren't taught when they were in school. So we see a passion within our supporters where they want to pass a more robust torch on to the next generation so that they're better equipped to have these conversations in a way that a lot of the adults in some of our small groups, just as we go through some of these studies on history and different areas, that they just really never learned. And so I appreciate the fact that we have an amazing group of lifelong learners who are wanting to be engaged in learning that new information. But at the same time, we're hosting this tonight so that we can inform people on how these processes are made. Our goal in Unity and Community is to stop that misinformation or disinformation on who makes what decisions and how they get made. And I don't know about you, but it's mind-blowing the layers that are embedded from the time something gets started to the time a student sits down at their desk to get that information. So I just want to look at the chat box for a moment, because I know there was a question from Kelly to Ms. Thompson about the timeline process for math. And I know, Dr. Nelson, if you or Ms. Thompson want to talk about that question and how you answered that question about teaching Math 4.
Yes, Dawn. So Kelly and I have been private messaging this whole time. So math, we've been going through curriculum development for math, we've learned that the way that our curricular resources for math have been designed do not honor alternate paths for learning math. It is grounded much more in procedural fluency, like worksheet, 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 and that there's only one way to learn the specific path or the algorithm. And so we started in elementary and middle school in terms of shifting that, and the shift has happened in high school math as well. And so Math 1 was our first implementation year, and that's going on this year. And it's really grounded around how do we ensure that kids show up with, how do we ensure we are amplifying what kids are showing up with in terms of math instruction? Kids don't come to high school math with knowing nothing. They actually know quite a bit. And the way that we go about engaging them looks different than it might if we are only talking about what's the steps you need to take in order to solve this problem, as opposed to what's going on here in this situation? What are you noticing? What patterns do you see? And then how does that translate into what you already know? And then how does the community in which you sit, i.e. the classroom in which you sit, then support you having a better understanding about how we might go about solving this problem? Oh, that seems like an interesting pattern. Let's explore that more, right? So math turns into a discussion as opposed to what many of you might have experienced, which is like, okay, here's the first problem. We're going to do this problem. All right, you follow me, do the same problem. Okay, everybody got it? Do the same thing over and over again. And what we all know is that that doesn't work once you start changing the numbers around, right? Like once you put a decimal in there, the whole thing changes.
And I started in Math 1 and had that experience with the new curriculum. It was awesome. The kids loved it. Big, huge community. And then a Math 4 teacher quit. So I went from being in that to Math 4, which was back to the old way. So I'm like, I can't go back. So I was just asking her how to get those resources.
Yes. So Kelly and I are going to be besties by the end of this. And so what her question was around was like, when is Math 4 going to look like Math 1, right? Like, it's clear and obvious that this is what you've done and it's right. So I want to know when that's going to happen. And so that's part of our discussion. So there's iteration. So like you guys might recall, where you can procure a curriculum or you can provision one. And that's what we are provisioning one. We are creating it. And so in order to make sure that it is well done, it takes longer than just dropping stuff into a learning management system. And so the angst that we feel with that is that it takes longer, but we believe that in taking our time to do this, we're going to create a high quality product that actually lives out what we are talking about when we say high quality math instruction. So, but Kelly has given me some ideas, and we're going to move forward, and then I'm going to check in with her and we're going to talk through some more stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I just want to highlight the characteristic of patience that our educators have, that we appreciate in terms of how long things come to fruition and go from decision making to impacting the classroom. One of the other questions in the chat box was, what are the best resources for a layperson to follow these legislation changes that affect education? And I know that Senator Marcus put a link in there to follow the newsletter as well. And you can also follow the ncforum.org. Which is a great resource to follow education policy, or ednc.org is also an option. We did put Jennifer's email address in there. So if you want additional resources or have questions, you can direct those as well to Jennifer. I know Pam had put a comment in there about, I wonder, would the Confederate monument in Cornelia still be standing if all of us had been taught the truth about our history, including why the monuments were built and what they represent. So that's a key part of threading that, keeping that in mind in terms of when you're teaching history, as an educator. And are there any other resources that are used as education gap fillers, assuming there is bureaucracy or tight timelines that may get in the way of truly delivering everything we may want students to learn from K through 12? So does anyone want to speak to that about in terms of the gap fillers, in terms of, resources when you are waiting on something to come down the pipeline?
I think I would start by saying that we have made a curriculum commitment on math and ELA. And as you guys know, there's so many more courses that are taught. Social studies is an example of where a curriculum does not exist that's aligned to those standards. And so where we are making investments is not only around the curricular resources that are present, but also the teaching practices that exist. And so for me, a lot of our work around gap filling is really around how do I ensure that as a teacher, I am reading the gap appropriately, that this is not an assumption I'm making about the student's competence or confidence, but that I have an accurate representation of what that means. And so we are provisioning resources to help teachers be able to make that assessment well. And then we also are provisioning professional development and resources to help them close that particular gap using resources that we've developed. So I would think about it more through the lens of what's the strategy to do that, not what is a thing that you can put in its place. It is the teacher that is doing that tactical move in that moment to support the student.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I know there was another question about how can conflict resolution and related concepts that were mentioned at Huff be implemented at other CMS high schools. I did put Global Minds United's website in the chat box as well, and we can always speak more specifically to whatever school you're in and how we can offer those same training sessions. And we'd certainly love to talk to anybody who's interested about that a little bit further.
Dawn, let me also say that we also do restorative practices. I'm trying to remember, and Ms. Shipp, if maybe you can help me out if you remember if it's at 40 schools at this point, but we are expanding that as well. A program where, between students also, that our counselors follow as they are, speaking with students who may have issues and, have experienced an issue at school. And so it's a really interesting model. And I have a great video. And if in a moment, I'll actually see if I can find it and I'll drop it in the link that explains how that came to be. And that's another investment that's being made currently to expand that across the district because it's been so successful and really trying to get at the root of what, anger or angst a child may be bringing with him or her to school and address the root cause and not just, the behavior at that moment. So I'll see if I can drop that in as well.
Right. There was some good work on that came from the district. You're right, Jennifer. Restorative practices and making connections was the key word in restorative practice. How do we make connections among us all that help us as we go through things, that there are connections? But I think that's a good piece. And you're right, Jennifer, I think we did some work on that. Staff brought that to us. And I know there was some PowerPoints as well as videos involved with that.
And I know, Maurice, you've had your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, hello. I am sinking into the shadows first, but sort of getting that out the way. So I would like to echo what Dawn said a bit back about the layers and how a lot of this information is helping me sort of pull back the layers on the decisions that influence educational policy. I recently graduated from Davidson College in the class of 2020 and joined the staff. Yeah, right, and joined the staff in the library. I do a lot of work around diversity and inclusion and specifically storytelling about untold parts of the college, but we are constantly confronting barriers when we enter conversations about what are the policies that need to change to improve the experiences of some of the negative experiences that are happening here. So I'm curious about what advice you all have to offer around organizing on a collegiate level with folks who are seeking institutional change in some of those policies.
Who wants to step up to the plate for that one? At a collegiate level, how can you help equip Maurice to make changes and connect to the policies that are barriers?
no one's really jumping on that one. I'm not, I'm not exactly sure at the collegiate level, and certainly within a private school, I don't know how they go about developing what their policies may be. But I will say this, just as an advocate myself, and someone who's on the receiving end of advocacy, is, keep at it. Don't give up. Organize. I mean, I can certainly connect with you offline. I used to live in Davidson myself. I live on the east side of Charlotte now, but I know some other Davidson students that would be, I think, interested in that same sort of advocacy work. And I would suggest that you come together, to present a plan of the changes that you would like to see. And I'm sure there is a diversity and inclusion person director, at the college level, but you might even be able to get to the president's office, with an idea around the change that you would like to see, and engage the students to keep moving in that direction. That would be the advice that I would have. Advocacy works.
Right. And I'll share right there, because my daughter's been in several colleges, and she was at Virginia State University. And one of the things that happened there is they did a lot of that work. She was involved in that. She was on SGA, student government, and she actually went up to be vice president. So, and even now in medical school, she's with the Student National Medical Association, and students are constantly, it's surprising to me, working through some of the same things that's going on in our society. What did they do with the George Floyd piece? Black Lives Matter. They were talking about it, believe it or not, in the medical school program. They were talking about it she was in undergrad. So I would connect you with some students from other colleges. I know some that have done some work around diversity. If you'd be interested in knowing a couple of names from some of the other colleges and universities, I do kind of link to that. So if you would be interested.
Thank you for that. And thank you for those resources. Beth, did you want to add?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer, but I have a wondering. I have often thought about the relationship between the acceptance process to get into college and then what happens at the high school level. How much of what we do at the high school level or can't do or feel like we can't do at the high school level because we want to make sure students are set up to be able to get into college. So I guess I'm curious about the relationship around policy and practice at the higher ed level on what could or could not happen at high school. And I think about something like grading. Like we look often at how we grade students, and technically it doesn't have to be a letter grade system, y'all. Or we don't have to assign numbers to it. And in best practice, we'd really love to be able to have it more based off of standards mastery and a more growth approach to how we assess what students know. But in many cases, because of something that's beyond public education or the need to participate in that system to be able to get into college, then that's going to drive a lot of what happens at the secondary level. Brandy, I don't know what you think about that, but I wonder about that specifically as something that I think it has a great impact on what happens in K-12 education.
No, thank you, Maurice. I think the reason why I didn't speak is because I was thinking. So I just need a beat to process. I think Jennifer's comment around what is the path to change that currently exists in terms of policy. I sit on the board of trustees for my college, for Salem College, which is a private all-girls school. And so the path to change it's not explicitly stated to students. It's actually not on purpose. And that was something that was part of our equity work in terms of we need to be explicit about when you want to change something in the university, what's the path to do so? And I think, and that came from students telling us if we want to change a policy, what's the plan? And we're like, So, I mean, I think step one is literally what Jennifer was saying in terms of let's find out, let's go ask, what do we need to do? And what's the current process and system in order to do that? And I think that also is a conversation around privilege in terms of, and why is that not explicit? And let's talk about how we make it explicit and accessible for kids to be able to rally around it and make some choices and decisions, especially if we're calling ourselves a democratic learning environment for kids.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. And that's why we're here tonight, really, is to provide an explicit process on the layers of education, so you all can understand how it works. I know One Love, your name on your profile is One Love. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, how are you now? Can you hear me? I just want to unmute it.
I'll
I'm trying
see.
to make sure I'm unmuted.
I think I hear you coming in and out still. You're not fully audible. Try one more time.
Okay. Let's try again.
Or if you want to type in the chat box, you can also type in the chat box as well. I'll come back to you and then we'll go to Lydia. I see Lydia has her hand up.
Okay.
I just, this is in response to Maurice's comment. Davidson College has a whole center for diversity and inclusion. And as a former staff member, I received a lot of information by email about the studies that they were doing and going back and looking through their history. And it all sounded very impressive to me. And I'm wondering if Maurice is experiencing that is what they're saying, but not necessarily what they're doing. And are you connected to Unity and Community? I'm sorry, are you connected to the Center for Diversity and Inclusion?
Yes, ma'am, very much so. And you will open a can of worms if we go down the direction of saying versus doing. That, oh man, oh man.
I hear you. This is probably not the forum for that. Thank you.
But I think that's important. I think, again, you have to remember, students came to Dr. Rosenbach and said, what do we do about this? Maurice graduated from Davidson College, and he wants to empower other students, and he's asking, hey, how do I do this? What's the process? Who can I talk to? What wisdom do you have that you can share with me? So I think that's really important to recognize that we all can be resources for each other in all of these areas because of those layers, and to create transparency and to ask those questions. And you see how the educators tonight explained all these wonderful ways about unpacking documents, setting up curriculum, setting up assessments, setting up instruction. There's a layer to all of this. And so you can apply that same systematic questioning in a variety of platforms, from a collegiate level to a high school level to a school level. So I think it's really important as we talk about advocacy and community that we recognize that we all can be resources for one another as these curious minds bring up these wonderful questions that push back in some areas, and not being fearful, being curious, not being fearful of getting to those answers. So that's what we want to cultivate. So I appreciate that. One Love, I'll come back to you if you want to try to unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I want to say, first of all, thank you everyone for having me on tonight. And this is awesome. This is totally awesome. You ladies should keep this going. October, December, January, February, every month you should keep this going, because I am learning some things here tonight that some things that I never heard of. But I just wanted to say that it's working. As far as the diversity, it is definitely working. We get out in the community and we work with children too that are young, all the way through high school as well. And just the love that I see in the kids coming together now is totally different. So we're getting rid of this racism that we had at one time, and I can feel it in my bones. I'm telling you, we're getting rid of it. We are on our way to a new day, and the teachers in school continue to talk about it. I know there are some touchy subjects, but you know, one thing I know about teachers, they have a heart. Teachers have always been such passionate people, and yes, you guys are underpaid, but you guys got hearts, and you guys are the true reason why you can have these conversations, because you guys really love each other. The love is deep in the school. So keep doing what you do. It's reaching the communities, trust me, and eventually we're going to win. We're going to all be one. We're going to all work together with no problems. Just keep doing a good job. I'm in your corner. Kudos, ladies. And again, thank you.
Dawn, if I can, let me say something here. I actually know Mr. Berry. I met him on Saturday. That's One Love, representing the One Love organization. But talk about advocacy. He spoke at our board meeting 2 weeks ago during public comment. And part of his organization is that they were partnering with Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department to give away free gun locks to families who, you know, maybe choose to be gun owners, to encourage that they lock their weapons, because we do know that many children get access to firearms through their family's home or their cars. And so he spoke at our meeting. I texted him through Facebook Messenger to get the repeat of the address. Ended up contacting, I know Senator Marcus mentioned it earlier, she's a member of Moms Demand Action, and sort of a subgroup under that is a group called Be Smart, and they do that same sort of advocacy and literacy in the community. So connected them. Anyway, we all ended up Saturday afternoon at on Beatties Ford Road passing out gun locks because of Mr. Berry here, who was an advocate. And I just thought that was an interesting story to sort of tie in, because I have a feeling he saw it on my Facebook page, and that's why he's here tonight. And I just love that this is how we do the unity and community that you're talking about, is by showing up, being advocates, reaching out, who knows whom, how can we get the right information or the right resources, in this case, in the hands. And I just wanted to tell that story quickly. Thank you for being here.
I just wanted to say thank you too. I saw them on Sunday. They were still there. My church is right down the street. So I want to thank you for that. I don't know, you knew that I drove by, but because I saw it and I was like, wow, it's Sunday and y'all just had it going. But thank you for that. So, and being, you know, right there on Beatties Ford Road, that was a good place to start. Thank you.
And I want to get to the question in the chat box from Chris Kite. He asks, how do you distinguish between basic education required by law and extra activities supported by a particular school? Could Beth or you, Dr. No, either one of you, if you want to talk about that, distinguishing between basic education that's required, which would be like standard course of study, I assume, and the extra activities supported by a particular school.
Brandy, I feel like we grapple with that all the time. I think what we're looking at is like what is required by the state or by our local board is going to be something that we seek and strive to have all students have equitable access to. And I think the decisions we make quite often are around what are those things, and then where are there to say, hey, we'd like to have this program, we'd like to have that program. What I see us leaning toward and seeking is that when that happens, that's a part of like a school choice or a magnet program. And so that there's a process for people to be able to opt into that. And it's not that it only happens at some schools or only at other schools from a space of not wanting students to have access, but that there's an opportunity for folks to engage in the school choice lottery, then be able to seek opportunities. It may not be the same at every single school. I'll say that we've struggled with is people knowing all that's available to them, both just in general at all schools, but also specifically through that school choice lottery. We still don't see large amounts of folks entering that. And I think that's something we would love to be able to continue to talk about. Brandy, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think the power of the principal to be able to, understand this is what the needs are in my school, and then this is how I want to partner. Our department has supported many a principal around that. So even if there's a financial constraint, we have we try to figure out a way to be able to help that school support that work. So if a school wanted to do the work that you're doing, Dawn, at Huff at another school, but they don't have the financial resources to be able to do that, then it would be working with our department around, what kind of co-curricular activity is available, or what are ways that we can partner, or working with the CMS Foundation to be able to provide that support. So there's avenues and ways for us to try to get creative about being able to meet the needs of that school. That's the only thing I would add.
Yeah, I just want to tie everything together so that we can finish on time as promised. As we know, we are bombarded with messaging from TV, media, across the board, social media platforms. And what we are doing tonight with Unity and Community is absolutely vital, because you are sitting with educators and professionals who have accurate information for you about how decisions get made, what's involved in the process. And so the second part of this was, we had a session, we have large group meetings at Unity and Community. And at one of our large group meetings, we were talking about what you see in the media and the hot topics in media around education. And Jennifer had mentioned, I think it would be a good idea if we can create a platform and a forum where we can provide accurate information so people understand decision-making and how it funnels down to impacting educators and students in the classroom. So I think, to Maurice's point, setting up forums like this, people are always willing to provide accurate information and to represent their profession in a meaningful way to the local community. So I want to give my special thanks to all of you who were panelists tonight, who created the PowerPoint, who've contributed resources, and most importantly, your time and energy and your advocacy within the educational system at all the many layers that you're involved in. Unity and Community invites any of you who are interested in joining our large group meeting that is going to be on October 23rd on a Saturday from 10 to 12. And we do cover various topics at our large group sessions. You can visit us at our website. You can email us through the website, and we can make sure that we get in contact with you. But I just want to say thank you for all of your time and information. Please access the resources that are in the chat box, as well as the email addresses for any additional questions, comments, or concerns. Do any of our panelists have any last closing remarks?
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for the work you do. As a longtime resident of this North Mech area, I know that Unity and Community is unique to the North Mech area, and I think it's fabulous what Pam and the other founders have been able to do, and keep going with it, because it's important work. So thank you.
Yeah, just thank you to you all. Appreciate it. Appreciate the rich conversation and the, as you said, the correct information that was hopefully delivered here tonight. And hopefully folks will come back on October 20th and hear about the impact of these decisions.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And we hope to see you next time for the second session.
Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer, for inviting